Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is author and Journal of the American Revolution contributor David Price, and he'll be discussing early abolitionist Lemuel Haynes. David, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brady. It's good to see you. And I mean see you.
That's right, new technology for all of us. David,
Right.
you've been on the show many times before. Remind everybody about your background.
I'm a non-professional historian, I guess. I would say I worked for the state of New Jersey for 34 years, and then when I retired 12 years ago, um, I kind of let my inner history nerd go full steam ahead. So since then, I've been working as a historical interpreter, which is a fancy name for a tour guide at Washington Crossing Historic Park, and more recently at Princeton Battlefield State Park, obviously both related venues. Um, and Along the way, I started doing some scribbling, so to speak, and I've written, let's see, we're up to 5 books now. Most recent one came out a couple of months ago, Winning the 10 Crucial Days. And that's I like to think of it as the third volume in a TCD trilogy. Everything has to have an acronym. And of course, I've written a few articles for JAR also. And Yeah, that's pretty much what I've been up to.
Excellent. So, David, what made you want to write this biographical sketch of Lemuel Haynes?
Well, I think it's been something that has been kind of percolating upstairs for several years. I first encountered him in Woody Holton's book, Liberty is Sweet. Actually, I have my copy here with me. Yeah, The Hidden History of the American Revolution, which came out in 2021. And I don't know if you've read that, but the that is I guess, reflects the modern historiographic trends in the sense that it um, integrates the story of how certain demographic groups were affected by what was happening back then. African Americans, women, indigenous Americans, into the main narrative as opposed to segregating them into separate chapters the way earlier, more traditional accounts did. So in that book, I first encountered Mr. Haynes, if you'll indulge me for a minute. Um, he's mentioned several times in the book, but there's a passage here, if I can read it, which really I think sparked my interest in him and doing something like this article, wherein Holton writes, in Europe, as in the United States, most whites who celebrated the Declaration of Independence focused on the specific grievances and on states' rights to secede, and did not quote either quote unquote created equal or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but phrases that seemed unimportant to Congress caught the attention of Americans who hated slavery. Before the year 1776 was out, Lemuel Haynes, a free black soldier in the Continental Army, had drafted an essay called Liberty Further Extended. He opened by quoting the Declaration of Independence's offhand assertions that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. By highlighting these claims, Haynes began the process of shifting the meaning of the Declaration from Congress's Ordinance of Secession to a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This movement would be carried forward by other abolitionists, the only Americans whose initial reactions to the Declaration focused on its equality and rights clauses, joined later by women's rights advocates, and eventually by freedom lovers all over the world. So when I read that, I thought, this is somebody I'd like to find out more about, and his treatise. And so, I kind of shoved it away in my mental file cabinet for a while, but then why I got back to it now, hard to say. But, I knew at some point I was going to want to do something more with him.
Excellent. So, David, in your article, you open up early on in the discussion with this, I guess, sort of anachronistic viewpoint, counterintuitive viewpoint. You have Americans talking about liberty on one hand, yet you have hundreds and thousands of people enslaved in the American colonies. Um, how we balance that. I mean, talk about your approach to that. How do you circle that square, so to speak?
Well, um, I think, and I've written about this uh, previously before this article, that slavery was, or I should say, the omnipresence of slavery in the colonies. Let's face it, it was everywhere. Obviously, a lot more prevalent in the South, but it was, legal and practiced in every colony before the Revolution, and that I think that the presence of slavery, of that, what Kenneth Stamp called a peculiar institution, the presence of that institution is, in a sense, inextricably intertwined with um, the motivation behind um, the insurrection, if you will, uh, and the revolutionists' fear, often expressed, of course, that adhering to British colonial policy, to the restrictions imposed by British colonial policy, would be tantamount to slavery. So many of them wrote that, from Washington on down, who I quote in the article. And notwithstanding the fact that they were aware of the certainly people like Washington were, of the contradiction, the inherent contradiction between their, striving for liberty, if you will, on the one hand, and then, practicing human bondage on the other. But that the reality of that institution's presence here, its ubiquity, as I said, I think was lent impetus to the this push for freeing themselves, shall we say, from the strictures of British rule, because this wasn't just when they talked about slavery and their fear of being enslaved by if they meekly submitted to British policy. This wasn't based on some abstract theoretical construct. They could see it every day in their lives. They could see what slavery meant, because whether they were practicing slaveholders or not, it was there. And so, in that sense, I think that the presence of slavery was fundamentally related to the ideological impulse, if you will, that um, ultimately led to the war.
That's, I think, really important points, David, because it gets us to the topic, of course, your article and of the interview tonight, Lemuel Haynes. What do we know about his early life? Again, he can be a little hard to track down at times, given his background. So, what could you tell us about the story we should know about him leading up to your article?
Yeah, we don't know a lot. He was born in 1753 to a black father and white mother in West Hartford, Connecticut. There doesn't appear to be any firm documentation for the identity of either of his parents or his name. Timothy Mather Cooley, who wrote an 1837 biography of Haynes shortly after Haynes's death, he suggested that the child bore the name of neither parent, but probably of that of the person under whose roof he was born. He was abandoned by his parents at age 5 months and was raised by a deeply religious white family, that of David Rose, who was a farmer and congregational deacon in Middle Granville, Massachusetts. And up until age 21, Haynes was legally an indentured servant. And one of the first things he did when he attained his or ended his indentured status was to enter the militia, served briefly with the militia, and then very briefly with the Continental Army. But during the time he was growing up, during the time he was an indentured servant, he laid the foundation, if you will, for his future pursuit as a theologian. He apparently, even as a boy, demonstrated remarkable intellectual gifts in terms of being memorizing scriptures and writing and delivering simulated sermons in such a way as to impress Deacon Rose and his family and his neighbors, which convinced them that this young man had the potential to be a congregational cleric.
David, in your article, you talk about just enormous challenges Haynes had to overcome. Some small, some big. All of them sort of inherent to the fact that he was an African American man uh, preaching to huge congregations of Anglo Americans, European Americans. Talk about those challenges and how he overcame them, because I think that's a lot of his story.
Yeah, he he earned the nickname the Black Puritan because of his um, steadfast devotion to a very orthodox view of religion. Whether and he adhered to that, throughout his I guess half century of preaching. Um, he was the first African American to be ordained in a mainstream Protestant denomination. Uh, Also, during that time, became the first African American to receive an honorary degree. This from Middlebury College at its second commencement in 1804. But during that time, as I say, he was um, an ardent opponent of deism and a firm upholder of religious orthodoxy. Now, to what extent that related to his the fact that he was preaching to, a virtually all white congregation in the various parishes which he served, mostly in Vermont. He was there, Rutland, Vermont, for 30 years, and then he had two other two other congregations in succession after that for the last 15 years of his life. Um, one in Vermont and the other in New York, upstate New York. So I don't know. One could speculate about, whether the fact that he was a black person preaching to a white audience, whether that influenced at all his, if not his religious views, certainly the way he presented them. The other thing that ties in here, which is curious, is that he, notwithstanding, the major focus of the article, which is on his 1776 treatise or essay against slavery, he very rarely spoke on that subject from the pulpit. There were a couple of exceptions, one on July 4th, 1801, commemorating the 25th anniversary of independence, and then again 12 years later. But for the most part, he was publicly silent on that, even while other ministers in the same region, same neighboring states, both white and black, preached against the evils of slavery and called for its abolition, or at least seeking to lessen its cruelty. And he was largely mute on the subject. Could that have been because the congregation was virtually all white? Perhaps. Could it have been because the Vermont Constitution had adopted included a provision prohibiting slavery? Perhaps. But there's an interesting quote if I can find it quickly, that was included in a book a century after, or almost a century after Haynes's death. This was written by Vernon Loggins, entitled "The Negro Author," which came out in 1931, and he writes about Haynes. And I thought this was a very, very interesting observation he made. If he had felt the scourge of slavery as strongly as he felt the scourge of a Puritan God, he might, with all his talents, have been an earlier Frederick Douglass for the race with which the America of today identifies him. So I think it's fair to say that, by and large, if you look at the totality of his record as a preacher, there's, you know, very little to go on in terms of his, you know, paying sustained attention to this issue. So clearly, his reputation here, as one of the early abolitionist voices, is predicated on that 1776 essay, which apparently wasn't discovered until Ruth Bogan, or Bogan, I'm not sure how you pronounce her name, discovered it in the course of doing research for an article she wrote for the William and Mary Quarterly, which appeared in 1983. And so she was the first to, if you will, unveil this very eloquent and powerful testimonial by a then 23-year-old man.
Yeah, David, let's talk about that essay. It was profound, and it was certainly worthy of an audience. Pretty remarkable that it was lost for so long. But what would be the in your mind the primary thesis of that 1776 essay?
Well, he's making a natural rights argument there, sort of along the lines of Jefferson in the preamble to the Declaration, and saying right at the top, of his essay, that the rights, those natural rights, are divinely given, and only the Almighty has the right to take them away. No human being has the right to do that. And so from there he takes off and tackles specific aspects of the issue. But that is the really the foundational aspect of this for him.
Did any certain passages or part of that stand out to you, David? Just in your opinion?
Oh yeah, well there are a number of them. Let me see. I did some highlighting here yesterday. So let's see if I can find a few without too much difficulty. Well, along the lines of what I was just saying, he describes liberty as a quote jewel that was handed down to man from the cabinet of heaven, and hence derived, quote unquote, from the supreme legislature of the universe. It is he who has a sole right to take it away, and therefore anyone who, quote, would take away a man's liberty assumes a prerogative that belongs to another. So he goes to great lengths to discount any religious or biological basis for slavery, noting the absence of any quote unquote precept or practice in the sacred scriptures that constitutes a black man a slave any more than a white one. And he asks, whence is it that an Englishman is so far distinguished from an African in point of natural privilege? Did he receive it in his original constitution, or by some subsequent grant? Or does he boast of some higher descent that gives him this preeminence? For my part, I can find no such revelation. And from there, he makes this very, very idealistic appeal for the rule of law based on the golden rule, essentially. He's arguing for a, quote, system of law whereby to regulate our moral conduct based upon that which was given by the blessed Savior of the world, by which, if we strictly adhere to the rule, we shall not impose anything upon others, but what we should be willing to have imposed upon us, were we in their condition. And from there, he tackles the quote unquote violent, atrocious slave trade, goes into very, very graphic and granular description of what that entailed for those who were being, brought in chains to these shores, writing about how, quote, generally many hundred slaves are put on board a vessel, shackled together 2 by 2, worse than criminals going to the place of execution, and crowded together as close as possible and almost naked. Then, too, excuse me, he writes that the families and friends who they left behind in Africa suffer, quote, the arrows, the grief, the distress and anguish when they must forever part with each other. And he makes an appeal to the quote unquote tender parents among white Americans, whereby he surmises, quote, what would be their distress should one of their dearest children be snatched from them in a clandestine manner and carried to Africa or some other foreign land to be under the most abject slavery for life among a strange people. He begs the reader to, quote, consider the miseries of a slave being under the absolute control of another, subject to continual embarrassments, fatigues, and corrections at the will of a master. How often are they separated from each other here in this land at many hundred miles distance, children from parents and parents from children, husbands from wives and wives from husbands. This institution is, in short, a hell upon earth, and all this for filthy lucre's sake. And from there, he goes after the he raises the straw man arguments that he's anticipating critics would make in defense of slavery, and rejects each one. One is the argument that the practice is based on the Bible. He finds no evidence of that. An argument, I guess, that in this would be very rare, I would think, that for upholding slavery in cases where they may be bought from their parents, he sees no justification for that. For if parents have a right to be free, then it follows that their children have equally as good a right to be free. And finally, he rejects the argument that made by slave traders that, quote, Negroes who are emigrated into these colonies are brought out of a land of darkness under the meridian light of the gospel, and so it is a great blessing instead of a curse. So Haynes says, well, that's tantamount to saying that doing evil results in something good. And he says that slave merchants do not aim at the spiritual good of their slaves, as evident by their behavior toward them, as they encourage quarrels and bloodshed among the various African nations, so as to generate an ongoing supply of slaves from those captured in these conflicts. And he points out that the slaves here were generally kept, quote, under the greatest ignorance and blindness, and they are scarcely ever told by their white masters whether there is a supreme being who governs the universe, or whether there is any reward or punishment beyond the grave. And finally, near the end, he offers a, tantamount to a threat, really, to slaveholders. Quote, if you have any love to yourselves or any love to this land, if you have any love to your fellow men, break these intolerable yokes and let their names be remembered no more, lest they be retorted on your own necks and you sink under them, for God will not hold you guiltless. And he winds up, getting back to what we talked about at the beginning, he winds up getting back to that obvious and agonizing contradiction between the claims for liberty, on the part of the founding fathers in support of the revolution and their practice of slavery. And he makes an appeal that slave owners, align their views on liberty to be consistent in both cases. So, and
Excellent.
that's the others basically, I think, the high points of his argument.
Okay, so David, what having written extensively about him, what do you think his legacy should be? How should we remember him in the Revolutionary period?
Yeah. Um, well, in a non-theological sense, which is what we're talking about here in terms of what he said in 1776, I think it's significant because it is a very his the case he's articulating is presented in a very compelling way. There's obviously a great deal of eloquence and passion behind it, um, written by a young man who um, was not at that point was not directly involved in the struggle for independence, but who did on the margins serve in that in what Washington would call the glorious cause. Um, and it's a powerful reminder of this inconsistency, shall we say, between what what we said we were struggling for on the one hand, and how we were treating this particular population. And if you want to extend that out further, uh, also, by implication or by extension, the um, lack of regard that was exhibited at the time by the founding fathers for other demographic groups as well, such as in terms of conferring civic um, or civil rights upon them, like women, like white men without property, and the indigenous population. So I think it's important in that respect, and also I think in terms of opening a window on what was to come with in terms of the not just abolitionism, but arguments for freedom for these other groups that would be made, going forward as we advanced into the early years of the 19th century.
Excellent. Well, David Price, thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Brady.